Welcome back everybody, this is King Kong 9100 and today I wanted to make a video on different ways the King Kong 2005 story goes. Now let me first start off by clearing up any possible confusion or questions. What do I mean by quote-unquote different ways the King Kong 2005 story goes? What I mean by that are the different interpretations of that story brought to the film. So this would be the more unknown, or at least the far lesser known, interpretations of the 2005 story. I wanted to cover all the iterations of the King Kong 2005 story, and while this does mostly span over the video games, that actually being the sole reason I was inspired to make this video, there are also different versions of the story what with the books and the novels, and while I won't be covering those today, I will go over all of the game versions. Let's quickly recap on the amazing 3+ hour journey that is King Kong 2005, before we get on to the other iterations. King Kong 2005 starts off with a montage of the Great Depression era 1933 New York City, more specifically, vaudeville. We're introduced to Ann Darrow, who's a starving actress in need of work once her job she works at closes. We meet Carl Denham, who's a filmmaker who found a map to an island he wants to shoot at, but as he's called crazy, he and his assistant rush to gather their crew to go to this island. We also meet Jack Driscoll, who's Carl's screenwriter for the film. Our crew goes to the island only to be met with the scariest natives ever. They go back to the ship, but Ann is taken by the natives and sacrificed to a god named King Kong. The crew encounters all kinds of creatures. Ann and Kong grow closer after their initial encounter. Carl plans on taking Kong to New York once his film is destroyed. Kong gets captured and taken to New York. He finds Ann and climbs up the Empire State Building and is then shot down by biplanes. Now of course I was very vague for time purposes, but that is essentially the film version of King Kong summed up in about a minute or two. Check the film out by the way if you haven't already, because it's absolutely phenomenal and without a doubt my favorite film of all time. Now that we covered the film, I want to go over the video game version. We'll start with the most well-known Kong video game, and that would be the version on the GameCube, PS2, Xbox, PC, and any other console I may have missed. They're all essentially the same thing, just on different consoles. So we get a recap of the film up to the point of the crew discovering the wall to Skull Island. From here on, our story begins. Our crew takes a lifeboat to Skull Island. What happens next is that the crew actually crash lands onto the island with a completely demolished boat and no means of escape. Hayes fires a flare and everyone gets a move on. The goal of the game is to find an open lake or river that Englehorn can land on with a seaplane to rescue them. We see them navigate through the rocky shores and horrifying village. One notable difference is that the natives spot the crew and spy on them throughout the island, unlike the film where they instantly attack after the initial encounter. Hayes and Carl split up with Jack and Ann, who navigate throughout the village. They get closer to the wall, and eventually Ann gets captured by the natives and Jack is met with the wall of natives before getting speared and knocked out. Here is where the difference between the film and the game really shine. Jack gets tied up and left to watch Ann get sacrificed to King Kong. Carl gets this all on film, then untying Jack as they venture into the jungle. The natives all throw spears at the two as they run off into the jungle, and they have a few encounters with Kong.
We got separated. I just hope he's still. Quick, Jack, we gotta
Carl eventually gets taken by a gigantic bat, and Jack rescues him. And then they carry on. Encountering more creatures, they eventually find and rescue Hayes. Trekking through dark caves, they then find Jimmy, Preston, Lumpy, and Choi. Suddenly, a V-Rex appears and kills all of them. So unlike the film, they all die differently here. Preston doesn't even die in the film, yet he does die in the game. After a V-Rex chase, Jack splits up and finds Ann, though she's taken by a giant bat. King Kong rescues her. Jack sort of acts on his own before meeting back up with Carl and Hayes. They eventually find Jimmy, who turns out to have survived, and they stick together until the log splits them apart. Much like the film, Carl's camera breaks and he decides he's finished. Instead, he splits up with the crew here, saying he's gonna go back to the ship. Hayes and Jimmy split up with Jack. King Kong is with Ann. He moves a pillar before breaking a door, but it turns out a V-Rex is right behind that door and charges him, completely knocking him off the cliff before giving chase to Ann. Jack finds and saves Ann. Jimmy and Hayes finally meet with Jack and Ann, and they stick together before being cornered by a V-Rex. Realizing there's no other choice, Ann calls Kong to save them, but gets captured. Hayes dies to the V-Rex, who literally runs him over while charging Kong, and we get to see a straight badass scene of King Kong and the V-Rex falling off a cliff while beating on each other. instead of King Kong taking 3 V-Rexes like the film's main battle, in the game, King Kong fights a V-Rex, gives chase to a bat that captures Ann, ends up killing 2 gigantic bats and a boatload of smaller bats, and then takes on 3 V-Rexes. Like, this King Kong looks much more powerful than the film version of Kong. Jimmy and Hayes share their last words before Hayes dies here, and Jack snaps Jimmy to his senses because of the oncoming Venatosaurs. After dispatching them, they make their way to the river where Englehorn landed the seaplane. He takes Jimmy with him and lets Jack know where Kong's lair is. Jack rescues Ann. King Kong fights 3 gigantic millipede or pteranodon-like monsters, and this is much like the original lair fight in the 33 film that didn't occur in the 2005 film. Ann and Jack jump off a cliff and barely escape from Kong. They make their way to the village, but Ann is captured by the natives again. King Kong rescues her, but goes to the shore to see the crew with gas bombs. So unlike the film, the game actually uses gas bombs and hits Kong with them. Kong passes out and is captured. He's taken to New York and goes on a rampage until he's cornered by the military. Ann rushes through the crowd and Kong takes her in, climbs up the Empire State Building, and is tragically shot down. The game does have an alternate ending though. Jack and Englehorn appear in the seaplane and engage in a dogfight with the other biplanes. And this dogfight is much like the original 1996 King Kong script, where it starts off with a dogfight Jack Driscoll is in. King Kong climbs down the Empire State Building after the battle with Ann in his hands, and the venture takes Kong back home. We get a really nice scene where Jack and Ann fly the seaplane around Skull Island's tallest mountain that King Kong stands tall on. He looks at the seaplane and roars into the air, a roar of goodbye, as the seaplane goes back to the venture. And that was the game version of the King Kong 2005 story. Many differences of what is overall the same story, but now I want to get into the other game versions. And now we arrive at the DS game, arguably the worst version out of all the games, but I still have fond memories of it. I want to make a whole other video on this version for different reasons, but to sum up how the story goes, the crew crashes onto the island much like the events of the console games. Jack, Hayes, Carl, and Ann all find the entrance to the cave. What's interesting is that we actually see what Jack Driscoll looks like, placed in environments of the console games. Pretty cool. So Jack and Ann enter the caves, fight a few crabs and a gigantic crab, and eventually get out and spot the seaplane. Jack is the one who insinuates the sailors launched a distress signal and that Englehorn needs to land on a stretch of water. He basically takes what most of Hayes' lines are. They open the door before Ann gets captured by the natives. Jack then goes to rescue her, and he eventually finds Carl. We learn Carl apparently shook off the natives, and then they get on their way. Jack and Carl cross a log, and Jack, for some reason, falls off. Not that Kong was there shaking it, Jack just literally falls off. Like, he does a straight nosedive into the ground, but apparently he's fine. So at this point, him and Carl are split up, and Jack sees where Kong is. Carl and Jack meet up again, and after this, Carl gets tired. He says to count him out, he's finished. Jack says he'll join them as soon as he frees Ann. He then sees Ann atop a cliff while King Kong is locked in battle. Jack gets Ann and escapes with her. They find a raft on a river. They get chased by the V-Rex on the river. After this, Ann gets taken by the natives and Kong rescues her. Now, unlike the console games, Ann is the one who exclaims that Jack and Kong are still down there when Kong is getting gas bombed. Meanwhile, in the main game, it's Jack who says that Carl is nuts since Ann is with Kong and he's hitting them with the gas bombs. So after Kong gets taken, he rampages in New York, then climbs up the Empire State Building before getting shot down by the biplanes. Now this game was really rushed and is repetitive as all hell, but some of the characters do act much differently than they do on film or in other games. And I want to make a whole other video on Jack's different character in the game, but yeah, the story does go a lot differently in the DS version. And now we arrive at arguably the scariest version of the game, the PSP version. The reason this game is so scary to me is because you are basically alone on the island for most of the game. The island just feels so empty, you know? You get the same game cutscenes from the console versions, but let's begin our story. So the crew crash lands onto the island and you play as Jack. Jack is completely alone. He fights the giant crab by himself and opens the door. He goes through the village and then cuts to Anne's sacrifice. Jack unties himself and gets going. King Kong fights a bunch of bats, and then we play as Jack. Eventually, Jack gets to Kong's lair. Kong fights gigantic millipedes instead of pteranodons, and then he leaves his lair. Kong gets hit with gas bombs, gets taken to New York. You know how it goes. I think it's just an eerie game since you're alone on this island all the time. Jack is stranded, he rescues Anne somehow, but that vibe is what really makes the game special to me. No matter how bad it could play, nothing is worse than the DS version. But the PSP version's atmosphere is one of its strongest aspects. And now we'll go over the Game Boy game, which is a different one entirely. Jack, Carl, Englehorn, and Anne are sailing through thick fog. They then find Skull Island. All but Englehorn go to the island, encounter the natives, but then leave once they realize the natives want Anne. Back on board, Anne tells Jack she can't sleep. She wonders what the natives built that wall for. Like, what are they trying to keep out? Anne gets taken by the natives right in front of Jack's eyes. Carl and Jack head to the village and analyze the wall. They hear Kong in the jungle, and King Kong makes his way to the gate and captures Anne. The sailors open the massive doors, and Jack and Carl make their ways to rescue Anne. From the jungles to the swamps and caves and temples, they encounter a lot. They find the entrance to Kong's lair, which is literally a door, but they need to place 2 statues into these pillars to get in. They do that, and the door magically opens. King Kong is fighting a V-Rex in his lair. Once Kong is down, Jack makes his way to Anne, and together they escape. The rest of the game is mostly these 3 finding their way back. Some boss fights include a massive V-Rex rising up in the temple from a dark abyss, and the crew fight it and have to dodge bites. You know, the roars can daze the crew, and sometimes it'll even sink into the abyss and start causing a ruckus to create a rock fall from above the temple that the crew needs to dodge. King Kong fights Venatosaurs, V-Rexes, Pteranodons dropping boulders onto him, charging Styracosaurs, but eventually Kong ends up breaking through the gate. Carl hits him with gas bombs and Kong goes down. Anne has her doubts back on the ship, but Carl ensures her that they will become rich. Back in New York, King Kong is strung up, this time standing on his legs at full height. Jack and Anne actually attend as well, and much like the original, Carl exclaims that he thinks you're attacking the girl. King Kong escapes, fights the military, and battles biplanes on the more level base of the Empire State Building. He places Anne on the edge of the building, and Jack tells her to give her his hand. If the player loses the plane battle, King Kong tragically dies. But if the player wins the plane battle, Anne climbs up and tells Jack a plan to get Kong off the building. They decide to go back to the boat, and I guess Kong would actually give chase and follow them to it. So what happens is that King Kong actually survives, and we see him literally jump onto the boat. And then we get a message saying, "Congratulations, you rescued Anne and Kong." So that is another way the 2005 version of the King Kong story goes. So if you guys noticed, the games offer alternative endings to their respective stories. The only ones that don't are the PSP and DS versions. And yeah, everybody, you know, books and novels aside, these are the different ways the King Kong 2005 story occurs. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I'll be back for more. This is King Kong 9100 signing out. Until then, bye bye.